thank everybody at Rockman for giving me a mulligan on this, because I was scheduled to do this last month and I had an emergency at work. I will tell everybody what it was because it was pretty funny. Where I work has the most complicated network I've ever encountered in my life. And given what we do, it kind of makes sense. I don't think I'm talking out of school here. This is a public number. Vanguard claims that it has $7 to $8 trillion under management. So it's a big responsibility. The network, what happened was someone changed proxy rules, which prevented all the Macs from communicating with software update. And we were using Nudge to try to deal with one of these CVE vulnerabilities. So we were telling people to update every 10 minutes and not giving them a path to get to the software update servers. And I didn't know that when that was happening, but that was the problem that I had to solve. And that is the reason that I missed the last meeting. So hopefully that explains a little bit the kind of emergency I was dealing with. I apologize for missing it. I'm sure the guys covered it gracefully, and I appreciate them giving me another shot at this. The second thing I want to say is there's a lot of smart people on the call. I know them from having taught them in classes or from LinkedIn. There's nothing earth-shattering in this presentation. I'm dumb. So there's nothing earth-shattering about creating a static group with an API script. But hopefully, if you're new to this game, what you will take away from this presentation maybe is something like how to apply some of these concepts, how to take information from one system and use it in Jamf to help with management. That's really what I want to get to if possible. So I want to give you a real world scenario that I had to deal with at work and the solution that I created for it. And maybe this will give you some ideas about how to do that yourself. So when Chris asked me to do this, and I'm sure a lot of you guys know Chad, who does a lot of these presentations for Rocketman. It's Chad, right? And Chris asked me what the title was going to be. And I said, well, I was kind of thinking of calling it "Don't Make Yourself a Cog in Your Own Machine." And Chris is like, man, you guys with the obscure names. He's like, I would just call it Dynamically Updating Static Groups with the Jamf API. So I have both. By the way, the art in these Rocketman slide decks is unbelievable. These slide decks are so good. This is Rocketman slides, not mine. All right, who am I? I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I did work at Jamf for 5 years. Before that, I worked as a systems administrator at an aerospace engineering firm in Phoenix for about 5 years. I was kind of drafted by Jamf to be part of the education team because of that experience. I worked at Apple for 3.5 years on the channel demo team. And what that means is that I worked on a team that was responsible for all the devices that are on display in stores that are not the Apple retail store. There are about 550 Apple retail stores in the world. There are about 250,000 points of sale. So the team that I was on was responsible for managing the demos on the devices in those 250,000 points of sale. Certainly didn't do it by myself. That is, if you consider that to be a contiguous deployment, which it really isn't, it's probably the biggest deployment of Apple devices in the world. It's about 1.5 million devices. So I did that for a while. I did work at Stars, the TV channel, as their Apple architect and systems administrator. And now I am at Vanguard, kind of doing the same stuff, back to a pure engineering role. And I'm pretty excited about that. That's who I am, in case you don't know. Now, what does this thing mean, this dumb statement? Don't make yourself a cog in your own machine unless, what does this mean? Well, this is not my line. This comes from another colleague of Chris, of myself and Chris from Jamf. Some of you, many of you, I'm sure know Bill Smith, who is a really great presenter. He almost always presents at Jamf. He has kind of a very pleasant Southern drawl. It doesn't really matter what he's saying. It just sounds good. And he always presents some, very perfectly portrayed subject at Jamf. I highly recommend going to his presentation if he's doing one this year. And this line is his. And what he said is, never make yourself a cog in your own machine. What I think he means by that is, if you have built an automation but there's one thing in the automation that you have to do to complete it, like click a button or run a script or do a thing in Jamf. You haven't really finished the task. So what we're going to talk about here today is maybe the tension between the idea of how much is it going to cost me to build an automation that's partially automated versus how much time do I have to build a fully automated solution that will run forever that I never have to fix again. But in general, I think Bill's idea is a good one. You shouldn't make yourself a cog in your own machine. If you can fully automate something, that's great. But if you've only got a limited scope for your project that you have to automate, maybe it does make sense to have a place where you have to click a button. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. Give me just a second here. All right. Cool. So these are kind of the topics I want to hit. I had this all nailed down a month ago. I have no idea what I was going to talk about then, but these were the topics that I kind of wanted to hit. At a micro level, I want to talk a little bit about code style and why it's important. I'm going to be showing you pieces of a script that I wrote. Token authentication in simple Jamf API scripts. I'm sure a lot of you already have this handled, but I think I have a pretty good and reusable little chunk of code for doing this now, and I'm happy to share it. I will be posting some form of these slides and some form of the script after the presentation, just in case you want it. I'm going to talk a little bit about using OSA script. This script is interactive. In other words, it collects the username and password, which are used to obtain the token. It's still a thing. Talk a little bit about loops and arrays, and talk a little bit about handling the different Jamf API data types. On the macro level, I want to talk about applying creative solutions to unavoidable problems. And what I mean by that is like, wow, this thing that I want to do doesn't seem like I can do it in Jamf alone. How can I integrate other data or other systems with Jamf to get the result that someone is asking me for? That's really the crux of the matter here. I love static groups. They're super useful. Obviously, smart groups are kind of like the killer feature of Jamf, but I think static groups are kind of like the overlooked redheaded stepchild, especially given the fact that you can create them with the API on demand. So what this workflow that I've created does is effectively builds an automation that allows you to populate and depopulate static groups at will, which makes them dynamic, right? Some of the deep cut Jamf API endpoints. I hadn't looked at this API endpoint before, and I was really glad it existed. So, you know, dig into your Jamf API documentation. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Using data from systems other than Jamf as the criteria for policy actions and scope. This is talking about, again, integrating other systems with the Jamf API. And very briefly, I'm going to touch on just the idea of, you know, using something like AWS runners or Lambdas or GitHub Actions and secret servers. All right. So what my problem was Microsoft Basic Authentication. Maybe some of you had to deal with this in your environment. Microsoft, I think about a year and a half ago, officially deprecated Basic Authentication, expecting everyone to move to modern certificate-based authentication. But for a number of reasons, many organizations couldn't do this. Maybe they hadn't updated their Exchange services. Maybe they had things that were requiring email automation that used Basic Authentication. That was the case at my organization. There was a service, several services actually, that were using email automation and Basic Authentication to send and receive those emails that couldn't be turned off because these were tied to business systems. Interestingly, Microsoft did not provide a configuration profile to do this. In other words, there was no local switch to say, I want this device to use basic authentication, but I want that device to use modern authentication. The only thing they gave you a key value for was disabling modern auth. And I hope that makes sense. If you weren't ready for modern auth, they gave you a key value that you could set to say, I don't want this device to do modern auth. But they didn't give you one to say, I don't want basic auth to be used ever. And we'll get more into that when we talk about the script. Microsoft authentication schemes use per session negotiation. And what that means is that the state or the authentication method that is used is determined by the session. If modern authentication is enabled in your environment and the computer is in, I'm not sure I understand. Oh, shut up, Siri. And the computer is in, or the device is in a situation where it is attempting to authenticate, it may fail over to basic authentication, even though modern authentication has been enabled. So that's what that means, per session negotiation. Microsoft also revealed that there was no client-side attribute for determining if an endpoint had logged in with basic authentication. So not only did they give us or not give us a key value for setting this, but there was nothing on the client that said whether basic or modern authentication had happened. So this was a problem because I was being asked by my messaging team, hey, can you disable basic authentication on the clients? And my answer was no, because there was no client-side attribute for determining that it had happened, and there was no key value for turning it off. Okay, what was the solution? Well, it turns out that the data that I needed to determine whether a client had used basic or modern auth existed, but it only existed on the server side. It existed in the exchange logs. The messaging team was able to give me that data as a CSV, just show me a list of users that had used basic auth. And Microsoft's idea for disabling it was simply to manually remediate the user's Outlook account. Well, instead of having to manually remediate it, I used Paul Bowden's Office Reset package for resetting the Outlook account. So in other words, my solution was, okay, I don't have the data I need in Jamf, but I do have the data I need in some other system to target the devices. And there was a manual remediation for doing this, but I know of an automatic way to solve the same problem. So how do I build a group in Jamf that will allow me to deploy my automated solution? That's the goal. So what I did was I created a script that ingested the CSV. It was a single column list of email addresses. And that email address was fed to the Jamf API to look up which computers were associated to that email address in Jamf. I then created a static group based on those computers and then ran my policy, which had the Office Reset package for Outlook in the policy on that static group. And I did this not at a regular interval. I did it manually once a week until I was assured by the messaging team that basic authentication had been disabled in the environment. Once basic authentication was disabled in the environment, this problem went away. But until they turned basic authentication off at the server, computers were still going to try to do basic auth as a failover method. And that's what we were trying to stop. All right, so let's get into the code a little bit here. First thing is just, these are the only two pieces of data that someone else besides me would have needed to feed this thing to get it to work. In other words, a path to the CSV file that has a list of email addresses and the static group that you are going to be modifying. This script does not actually create a new static group. It modifies an existing static group, but you could easily modify this script to both create a static group and then modify it if you needed to.
It's really frustrating when it's like a lot of the time.
Sorry?
He tends to forget to tell me things too.
I'm having a little trouble hearing what you're saying. Am I doing something wrong, or was it a question?
Sorry, that was me. I'm having an issue. That's me. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay, no problem. Cool. So, want to talk a little bit about this. This is the the code that I've been using for generating Jamf API tokens. I'm sure you guys are using something similar. The only thing that you might want to take note of here is that I have a little function for generating the valid or determining the validity of the current token, meaning it just checks the HTTP code of the token and returns that as okay or invalid. The reason this is useful is because you might be running a Jamf API thing that goes for longer than the life of the token. The tokens are valid for 30 minutes. So if you need to create a workflow like that that runs for longer than 30 minutes, you could use a function like this to determine when your token is about to be invalid and then issue a new one or re-up the same one. The other thing I want to point out here is that what I'm doing with these variables is I'm kind of concatenating the Jamf URLs and the API endpoints such that when I use them in the curl commands later in the script, I don't have to remember which endpoints go with which URLs. And I think that will be apparent more when I get down further here. And I already talked about the token. All right, the other thing I wanted to talk about here is the encoding of the Jamf API credentials. I've seen a couple of different versions of this. Basically, the requirement is that you just need to have the username and password separated by a colon on a single line. And that's what this echo-n does. And then you need to base 64 encode those credentials. And that form of your username and password, assuming that that user is an API user in Jamf, will generate a valid Jamf API token. All right. And this is where I wanted to talk about data types a little bit. One of the things that is probably confusing for new users to the Jamf API is that there is currently this V1, what is referred to as the Jamf API, and then there's the classic API. The classic API has always been able to output data as both XML and JSON, but it will only accept data as XML. The new Jamf API, the Jamf API, is JSON enabled. So you can do either one up and down, but what you have to realize is that when you're using a Jamf API token, you're going to be negotiating with the Jamf API, not the classic API. And that data is JSON, right? So in this script, I'm actually handling two different types of data from the API. I'm handling both JSON and XML just because that's how I wrote it. But the token is here, as you can see, I'm using JSON. Here, in order to actually get the data from Jamf, in other words, to push up an email address and return the computers that are associated to that email address in the Jamf database, I'm requesting that data as XML. And then, as you can see, I'm using XML lint to parse the output of that data, which is a technique that I've used for a long time. Almost every single one of my API scripts does this same thing. There's a lot of ways to do this. This is just a way to do it. But the point I really want to make here is that you might have to create a Jamf API workflow that handles more than one data type. Another thing I want to mention here is that, sorry about that. The email address needs to be formatted for a URL. In other words, there are encoding strings for URLs for things like spaces and special characters. So in this case, because I'm pushing up an email address to the Jamf API as a URL, I need to format it to handle the @ symbol, which is what that command does right there. And then this is the endpoint that I was talking about. It's user/email, and then the email address. So one of the Jamf endpoints lets you look up a user by email address and then return the computers that are associated with that. It does that by looking at the user the username part of the record. the computer record. So it's very, very handy endpoint. And here, I just want to mention that what I've got on the left there is the Jamf API documentation. If you're not familiar with it, you should make yourself familiar with it. Just go to the URL for your Jamf instance /API. You will be able to select the docs for either the classic API or version 1 of the API. And then you'll be able to test all of these commands with actual data. And you can't really break anything in there. They don't let you delete anything. You do need a valid API account, but you can get all sorts of data. It will show you a formatted version of the curl command that was used. It's a very, very good resource. And it's really the only way to generate these kind of custom API calls is by familiarizing yourself with this documentation. I highly recommend it. The last thing in the code here I want to talk about is these are the curl commands which I used to delete the existing static group, update the existing static group, print out my changes, and then invalidate the API token. And the reason I'm doing that is because at the end of this automation, right, you don't need the API token hanging out there. So once it's done its thing, you can kill the token by invalidating it, and that makes your session more secure. So the thing to note here is that the order or the HTTP methods that are used in these curl commands, I'm using a put to update the static group that I want to use. And what I'm doing is deleting it. I'm actually putting blank data in there. You can see in the -D part of the command. And then I'm verifying that everything was deleted by just printing it out. Then I'm updating it by uploading the concatenated list of computers that I've obtained from the previous API call. And then I'm printing that out with another get command to show me, hey, here's the list of computers, is this right? And the fact that I was doing this manually, it makes sense to do it this way because if there was anything wrong or if I had added a computer in the smart group that wasn't supposed to, static group that wasn't supposed to be there or vice versa, I could change it. Here is a demo of the script running. And the first thing you're going to see here is a little bit of OSA script or Apple script. And what this does is allows me to collect the username and password without having to store those strings in the script, which you should never, ever, ever do. And this will show you what happens when a failed authentication occurs. It doesn't give you a token and it just fails. Now this will work with the correct username and password. And you'll see that first it shows me that I have a valid token. And now what it's doing is inputting each email address that you see here. And it's telling me which computers in Jamf are associated with that email address. It also will print out at the bottom email addresses that didn't find any computers that were associated. And now it's running those commands that I showed you at the end. And I think I'm going to scroll back up here and show you what it did. The first thing it did is it printed out the blank group, meaning I've deleted everybody that was in there before. And now I'm updating it and I'm verifying the computers that were added or that were listed out above. Pretty straightforward. Again, like I said, there's nothing earth-shattering here, except maybe some of the ideas about connecting these data sources and the entire workflow of the project itself. And as you can see now in Jamf, the result is that those 4 computers have been added to this static group. That was my goal. That was my intention. All right, so Epilogue. There was a single business unit in the company that was preventing basic authentication from being disabled at the server. If that business unit didn't need basic auth, this would never have been an issue. So in other words, somebody in the company came to me to solve their problem. This happens sometimes, and it's great to be able to provide solutions like this. It's a sign of, the endpoints are at the end of the chain. All of the poopy water flows downhill towards the endpoint guys. And it's great when the endpoints can be part of the solution and not considered the problem. When the endpoint engineers can fix something like this, it's a big win for everybody. This workflow ran in the environment for about 10 weeks, meaning I ran this script once a week for 10 weeks myself on Friday nights or whatever it was, because I have no life. Once that business unit resolved their issue, basic authentication was disabled at the server. Great. Over the course of time, about 250 users were prevented from using basic auth, which made the security people happy. And now that we have disabled basic authentication in the environment, all devices, iOS devices and computers are using modern auth to connect to Microsoft services. This is a joke for the Jamf people. This is what Jamf says in your case when they've closed it. Sometimes they say this even if they haven't solved it. Just letting you know that. Now, why shouldn't you do this? Well, the scope of this project was finite and it was time delimited. And I felt that, as I said here, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze to fully automate it. I could have built an integration between the Exchange service that would have automatically retrieved the email addresses and fully automated this solution so that I didn't have to touch it. But I knew it was going to be over in a matter of 2 months. So I didn't do that. So in this case, I did make myself a cog in the machine, but I only did that because I knew that I shouldn't, but made the determination that the scope of this project made it okay. These kind of scripts using these Jamf API tokens is perfectly secure. I'm not sure that everyone understands why using the token is more secure than using username and password, but let me just talk about that for a minute. If you're making the same curl command over and over and over again in your script, if you're using username and password, you're passing your username and password every single time to do that. And if there was a theoretical man in the middle, that would be bad. If you're using the token, you're passing the token every time. So it not only is it bad to have your password and your username written out in the script, but it's also bad to pass it every time to Jamf to get your data. So the token is just more secure all around. You should learn some sort of technique for using the tokens, and that's fine. What would be even better than what I did is instead of locally generating a token, you should use AWS Lambda or GitHub Action or Bitbucket or whatever your company has to do these sort of automation workflows to build this stuff. That's much better and really the only secure way to fully build an automation like this. And finally, the secrets, where do you store your username and password if you do something like that? GitHub Actions, frankly, the secrets is not viable for most companies because they only store passwords as base64. They don't really encrypt anything. So if you're using a system like that, you probably will be using AWS Secrets Manager or some other secrets solution that your company already uses. And maybe that thing has an API where it lets you pass your username and passwords securely to obtain the token. And that's really, I just wanted to say these two things at the end to say, the only secure way in an enterprise environment to build a workflow like this is to use some sort of real secrets manager and some sort of real runner. But what I've built here is perfectly secure. It's just kind of a halfway solution. That's it. So, like I said, I'm going to be posting some version of this script on the Rocketman GitHub. I wanted to talk real quick about links because these are things I've mentioned. Office Reset. If you don't know about these packages, these are created by Paul Bowden. Paul Bowden works for Microsoft. He's kind of the Mac guru at Microsoft. He has made all sorts of useful packages for resetting applications in the Office suite. If you don't know about these things, go to that site right now and look at them and download them. They're amazing and huge time savers. The developer.jamf.com API docs, highly recommended. Go to, as I said earlier, go to your Jamf instance.jamf.com/API, whatever your URL is. Look at the API docs. If you are interested in people say, how do I write an API script? The first place to look is the Jamf API documentation that exists in your own Jamf instance. Look at the endpoints, learn what they do, and you will be miles ahead in that game. Finally, there is an article written by Bill Smith on Jamf Nation on how to convert classic API scripts. What he means by classic is using basic username and password to the bearer token. Now, Bill's workflow will result in a much, much longer thing than mine. The thing that I've posted is about 25 lines. The thing that Bill posted is about 150 lines to generate the token. It doesn't matter which one you use, they do the same thing. But I like to make code as short as I possibly can without harming its functionality. So that, that's because I'm psychotic. That's it. I'm done.